Why, hello, welcome to the Theology Podcast. It's great to have you with us. And if this is your first time tuning into the show, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor in the Pacific Northwest, although today I'm in Connecticut, and I've written some books, and I've been a professor of philosophy, and I'm actually on the board of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters, and that will be relevant in a minute or two, and you'll see why I bring that up. But enough about me. What we're going to do is we're going to go around the horn. We're going to have Tom and Glenn introduce themselves. And then we have a special guest, a friend of mine, who's come on the show, and we'll let him introduce himself and then get into the topic of the day. So, Tom.
Tom Price. I'm also in Connecticut, and it looks like I have the sun on my side. That's why you don't see it on Chris. I'm being illumined by it. I teach systematic theology, philosophy, Christian thought, and ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places.
Great. Glenn.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor, a refugee from Connecticut, currently in South Bend, Indiana. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries.
Great. Well, today we are privileged and glad to have a friend of mine on the show, Luke, who is in God's country, Western Pennsylvania. And he's going to talk about some things that he's involved with. But rather than steal your thunder, Luke, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself and we can get rolling here.
All right. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. My name is Luke Sheahan. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, God's country, Western Pennsylvania. And I'm a non-resident scholar at the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania.
Good stuff. Now, give us a little bit of background on your theological and church affiliations, Luke, because I think it'd be good for some of our folks to know where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I am theologically, I'm Reformed, been a Presbyterian for about 15 years now. I was raised like a non-denominational evangelical, and I moved to Philadelphia to take a job, and I started attending 10th Presbyterian Church, and it was Phil Ryken was the senior minister there at the time, and so I kind of was brought into the Reformed fold through my experiences there, and I've been in the Reformed fold ever since.
Great stuff. Well, it's great to have you on the show, and the statement I made about being a member of the board at the Academy of Philosophy and Letters is relevant because you are the president of the board for the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. Folks may be wondering, what in the world is that? What is APL? Can you give us a little synopsis?
Yeah, so the Academy of Philosophy and Letters is a organization of policy people and academics and kind of thoughtful people, some of which could be termed public intellectuals, who are interested in the relationship between politics and culture. And the organization's been around for somewhere around 15 years, and it started back in the early 2000s as a group of cultural conservatives of various sorts from the think tank world and the academic world who are concerned with the direction of conservatism kind of at around the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And so a number of traditionalist conservatives who are concerned with what might be uncharitably called the warmongering and the party.
You mean the neocons?
Yes, the neocons. So they were concerned that it was going to be ultimately destructive in terms of the successes of those wars for the people that would be involved with them on the other end, as well as at home. So conservatism has had a long traditionalist conservatism has a long concern with war. So if you read traditionalist conservatives like Robert Nisbet or Russell Kirk, they're very concerned with the cultural ramifications of a country that is at war. Now, sometimes war is necessary, but it always has devastating consequences for the country that goes to war, not just the country that's invaded, but the country that has to mobilize in wartime. There's kind of an enormous, it takes a sledgehammer to the social realm. And this goes all the way back. Robert Nisbet, the great 20th century American sociologist, was incredibly critical of virtually every president since Woodrow Wilson for the war state. He calls it the war welfare state. So you can't have a war state without also having kind of massive social programs that mobilize the country. So he sees Wilson's war state during World War I as the first totalitarian state. He means by that is not totalitarian in kind of the thorough sense of contemporary China, but in the sense that the federal government did things it had never done before to make American citizens thoroughly American and behind the war effort. So you get suppression of German immigrants, suppression of the teaching of German languages. I mean, a funny family story is my great grandmother was German, and she knew German, and her kids would hear her talk on the phone in German. But she had been, a little girl growing up during World War I, and she lied. When people would ask if she knew German, she said she forgot it. Anyway, it was a full-faced lie because she talked on the phone to her family in German. But did not want to be seen as a German during that time.
Right. That's really, I think, important information that I think most folks who maybe are, most folks who see themselves as conservatives would not even know was the case with regard to traditionalist conservatism. And this brings up something that'd be worth talking about a little later on the show, and that's maybe the varieties of conservatism, or what go by the name conservative, and why traditionalist conservatism needs to be, promoted and kind of recovered and rediscovered and so forth. Now, you're also the new editor of the University Bookman, and you mentioned someone in the course of your comments a minute ago that is relevant in this regard. So talk about the University Bookman a little bit.
Yeah, so the University Bookman was founded in 1960 by Russell Kirk. So Russell Kirk was he's seen as like the godfather of American conservatism. So he gained fame in 1953 when, as a relatively young man, he was 35, he published his doctoral dissertation at the University of St. Andrews titled The Conservative Mind. And so what he did is he said that there is a conservative tradition in America, and at the time, it was thought that there wasn't. So America was thoroughly a Lockean liberal country. We'd never had anything like a conservative tradition. We were a new country. We weren't like Europe. We were just thoroughly liberal. There was nothing else. And so he wrote this book called The Conservative Mind. He said that isn't true. There's been a strain of conservative thought going all the way back to the founding. And so there were founding fathers, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, who were not Lockean liberals. They had a very dim view. They were more, at best, Humeans. They had a very dim view of human nature. And they saw government power not as about the liberation of the individual, but as about ways in which we could constrain the passions of individuals. You can do this in various ways. Well, you have to, of course, constrain government, but you don't do so because government can suppress individuals. You do so because government is run by individuals, and those individuals are fallen too. So you somehow have to have a government that's empowered in such a way it can constrain individual passions, but also structured in such a way that it restrains itself because, of course, it's run by individuals who are themselves fallen. So whatever the actual religious views of Adams and Hamilton, they had a very Christian anthropology, and they believed in the fallenness of man, even if it wasn't a literal fallenness. It was certainly empirically true that human beings were fallen.
Yeah, that's right. Wasn't it Chesterton who said that the fall or original sin is the only Christian doctrine that can be empirically verified?
That's right. So Kirk said this strain has been there from the beginning, and it's run through. And he kind of goes through a bunch of thinkers. He sees Burke as he looks at American as well as English thinkers. As Burke is kind of the founding father. So right after as the French Revolution happens and kind of the modern world comes into being as we know it. There were conservative thinkers who were concerned about the destruction of the social order that this new type of democratic power was bringing to bear. They were concerned about changes in political structures that could have deleterious effects upon family and religion. They were concerned about rationalism. They thought that human reason was too shallow to really grasp fully truth. You had to depend upon aesthetics and tradition to really understand the world in important ways, and that this tradition runs all the way through American history. So we've always had these thinkers around. We just haven't quite recognized them.
It'd be great. It'd be great to have a show sometime, maybe on Burke, because he's an interesting figure in the sense that there are things about him that maybe some folks wouldn't think could be sort of reconciled in a single person. In Boston, for example, on Boston Common, there's a statue of Edmund Burke. Among all of the statues that you have there's one for Burke.
Yeah. Yeah, there's one in D.C. as well.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah. You wanted to say something, Glenn?
The thing that is a lot of people don't really understand in America is the impact of the French Revolution.
Right.
We have a long tradition of political thought in the West, a lot of it anchored in Christianity. And in a very real way, that whole project gets derailed by the French Revolution. And everything that happens after that is either for the revolution or against the revolution. That's that becomes the entire tenor of political theorizing and discourse.
Right.
So your liberals are people who generally supported the goals of the revolution. Your conservatives said, "Wait a minute, society's way too complicated to fit into your nice, neat little box."
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. This is a nice segue into some other things that we want to get to with regard to like classical liberalism and so forth. But before we do, let's spend a little more time on the University Bookman. So, if somebody wanted to check out the University Bookman, what should they expect when they find it? What is it for?
Good. Yeah. So Kirk founded it in 1960. So shortly after he kind of came into kind of his meteoric rise with the conservative mind. So it was. I think the New York Times Review of Books, they gave a whole issue to it. It was just a huge kind of phenomenon. So he kind of was catapulted, in his 30s to the kind of national fame as a thinker, and he founded the University Bookman in 1960 to have a forum for engagement with humane literature and humane books. And so the Bookman's kept that up for 60 years. So heavy emphasis upon literature and literary criticism and kind of the humane studies, humanities in the original sense of the term, not the humanities as you'll necessarily find them today, but the original humanities, where you're thinking about the larger questions and questions of culture and truth and goodness and beauty, and exploring those questions there. So the Bookman's mostly book reviews, not entirely, but mostly book reviews and humane essays, you would say, exploring kind of essential questions. Kirk was fond of the term, rather vague, admittedly, of the permanent things. He was about preserving the permanent things. And he was not keen on listing them off. So he was not a French revolutionary. listing what the permanent things were. And Kirk saw that society and reality was too complex for that. But we could study these things and delve into them. So the Bookman has for 6 decades now been kind of masterfully run by Kirk, edited it for decades, and then Jeff Nelson, his son-in-law, edited it, and then Gerald Rossello, who just passed away last year, did a very good job in shepherding it through. And so I hope to live up to their legacy in terms of that mission alive.
Yeah, well, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
So you're the 4th editor.
Yeah, as far as I understand, there's been just a handful of editors, so it's been a kind of one of those places that as a rarity. It's kept around. Its editors have kind of stood for a long time.
Now, am I correct in believing that it's still in physical print, or is it just an online thing?
It's just online today. Yes.
Okay. So where would they go to find it?
Yeah, so the Kirk Center has that on its website. So you can Google the University Bookman. It's the first link that comes up. But it's there, and it's I would say it punches above its weight in terms of keeping alive kind of a real cultural conservatism and thinking deeply on the humanities and kind of the tradition of humane letters alive that Kirk was really central to. I think he's written some great books, but I think he really shines in his essays, where he tackles these. He just drawing from he was a bit of a polymath. Yes, there we go. And he had read Mark Twain and Hugo. Victor Hugo, by the age of 10, he had kind of worked through a lot of the great literature. And so he was drawing from all of that in his essays and in his works. And it's really just, he was also had a photographic memory. He was I'm a little jealous. So he, was it was like C.S. Lewis, where,
right.
Somebody could pull a book off his shelf and flip it open and read the first half of a paragraph, and he'd complete it. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, they are people with photographic memories are very scary. I when I defended my doctoral dissertation at Oxford, Paul Fittis, one of the professors of theology, was like that. And he asked me a question that I had to go look for the quote in my own work and the page. He knew the page number and he quoted to me my whole section. I said, this is just completely unfair.
Right. So just over the last 10 minutes or so, you have addressed, a theme that, Tom and Glenn and I are familiar with, but perhaps our listeners are not familiar with. For a lot of folks, who watch Fox News or maybe attend an evangelical church that's theologically conservative, when they use the word conservative, they think it refers to just a single thing. But in reality, within sort of particularly political thinking, political philosophy, there are different stripes of conservatism. Perhaps there really is only one, and all the others are phony. But I'm giving away my thought. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Luke.
Yeah, so we generally think of the conservative movement as kind of having three strains, and the reason we talk of them together is they ended up, as a practical matter, being allies in the post-war American landscape. So World War II happens, and you have an intellectual kind of renaissance or efflorescence. So on the left and the right. So you get the new left has kind of a lot of interesting thinkers who come in, and the right does as well. So Russell Kirk, of course, is among the foremost. Bill Buckley is a young man at this time. He publishes God and Man at Yale in 1951. Robert Nisbet publishes The Quest for Community in 1953. Kirk publishes The Conservative Mind in 1953. You have Whittaker Chambers published Witness in 1950, right around there. Peter Varick publishes a book on conservatism in 1949. And there's just these thinkers who are thinking about what it means to preserve the constitutional order and Western society in light of the great turmoil of that half of the 20th century. So you have two massively devastating world wars. You have the rise of totalitarian ideology, which was, some people saw it as this was a new thing. I think it was, who was it who said that, we have that traditional understanding of political order, of, aristocracy, monarchy, democracy. And then, it's got 6 types: rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many, and then rule by the one for the good of all, or by the good of one, rule by the few for the good of all, or by the good of the few, and rule by the many for the good of all, or by the majority. So kind of 6 types. And then you have in the 20th century rule by ideology. And so the first time you have communism, Nazism, like what is this? Where you have a rule by an ideology in a way that some argue we hadn't seen before, and they're massively destructive. Have tens of millions of people butchered by their own governments. I mean, it's an astounding fact of the 20th century that this happens. And in the middle of the 20th century, there are thinkers trying to come to grips with what it's going to take for Western liberal democracies to not march down that road.
Right. Now, I think it's worth noting at this point that there are a lot of folks out there that I know use ideology as a kind of synonym for philosophy. But that's not the case. We've always had philosophy, but ideologies are something that's a more recent phenomenon. Can you maybe get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so Kirk was very adamant that conservatism was not an ideology. And the reason he said that, he said ideologies are political creeds. The French Revolution had its list of things it believed, and you're shot or not shot based upon how well you can pay fealty to a set of principles. And so conservatism isn't like that. It's not a set of principles per se. Now, Kirk had his list of canons of conservatism, but they're a little more, how do I put it, imprecise, you might say. And this makes it a little tough to actually define conservatism. So some people say, well, it's more of a kind of a personal inclination. Are you the type of person who's more cautious, kind of by nature? Well, that makes you a conservative. And I think that's kind of a little bit of an oversimplification. But what Kirk was getting at in rejecting the term ideology was that conservatism isn't just a list of principles that we're all devoted to in the way we might be devoted to a creed. Well, even if you understand, Christianity we have our creeds, of course, but creeds will recognize a second order reality. They are helping to get us to the person of Christ. And we want to make sure we don't forget really important things about who Christ is. And we put them in creeds so that we can remember them and keep them at the forefront of our minds. But we remember that the creed is the way of getting to the historic reality of the incarnate Christ. And ideology has its creeds, but and it sees it as it's a better way to talk about it is a faux creed. So it's a list of principles that's getting to a false reality. So the French Revolution had its list of principles, but they were about radical equality that didn't recognize the actual depth of human beings and the reality of our equality before God, because of course it rejected God. So he didn't get to have that type of equality. You had some sort of faux equality that didn't actually exist. So you had to, it's why kind of aftermath of the French Revolution leads to all these utterly destructive revolutions around the world, like the Cambodian revolution, where you kill people who wear glasses. Because you got to make everyone the same. So people are higher educated. You got to kill them.
Hide your glasses, Glenn.
And so you got to kill people with glasses. You got to kill people with more education. You got to kill people who had parents who were better, more well off than other people's parents, and because you're trying to get back to an equality that's impossible. I mean, we all come from different backgrounds, and you recognize that.
So an ideology is kind of a set of ideas that are imposed upon a reality that doesn't presumably have any sort of inner structure of its own. There's no real out there to encounter and know. Instead, there's something to create that is just a sort of an abstraction, kind of a cookie cutter that we impress upon the world. And that is not philosophy, nor is it, as you noted, Christianity classically understood. Although I have come across people for whom Christianity does kind of work like an ideology. They really don't think of it as being a revelation of something that was real before that came into their heads. It's more or less something that they have to impose on reality that is just sort of like out there and consequently has to be shaped by Christians. So anyway, that's maybe that's another show we can have you back for.
That's right.
Right. So now, so we've talked a little bit about ideology and conservatism as it was understood by, Kirk and Buckley and so forth. Let's think about what these other sort of understandings are that traditionalist conservatism is different than.
Yeah, so it's different from another strain is classical liberalism. So classical liberalism is kind of born in the 19th century, or you could earlier, you could link it to Locke, of course, late 17th century. But the idea was it's a heavy emphasis upon individualism and individual rights. So classical liberals saw individuals as kind of the center of society, and you wanted constraints upon government power, at least to a certain extent, to make sure the individual was free. And if you could free the individual and keep the individual free, you would kind of see a lot of kind of the individual had a kind of an innate goodness that could be kind of unleashed. Now, there's a tension between traditionalist conservatives and classical liberals, and you probably know where I'm going with this, is that classical liberals also believe that traditional social groups are one of the worst offenders in terms of suppressing individual talents and kind of the individual goodness. So there's been a tension historically between classical liberals and traditionalist conservatives, and traditionalist conservatives see, for whatever flaws that might exist in religious institutions and the family and local communities and all of that, there are also the means whereby individual talent is cultivated and finds expression. So you really can't talk about individuals. And Robert Nisbet was very, very keen on this point. He said that the eras we see as kind of producing the most extraordinary individuals are not eras of individualism. They're eras of very strong small social groups. So usually you see the family is very, very strong. And you'll so when you have a Shakespeare arise or a Plato arise, you see all these small groups. So what's Plato doing? He's hanging out with Socrates and everybody else in these tiny, kind of tight-knit groups talking to each other. And then there's the genius comes forward. And Shakespeare is not the singular genius. He's a genius among geniuses. And they're talking to each other, writing, exchanging. The Inklings, another one. These great writers, but they weren't great writers on their own. They were in communion with each other and close friends and sharpening each other. And and Nisbet always pointed out, when you see the great individuals arise, it's not because of individualism. It's because of these small, tight-knit groups that are able to hone in individuals and help them to sharpen them such that they actually are a strong individual as we understand them. But it's not because of individualism that happens.
Yeah, this is a paradox that I've just observed in the course of my ministry. Some of the most interesting and quirky people I've known have grown up in what would be considered by classical liberals as well as progressives oppressive environments. They were in these very tight-knit communities where there was a lot of pressure that was sort of placed upon them to conform to certain moral standards. They became who they were because of those environments, and were believers most of the time in the standards that they had been encouraged to adopt, that had formed them. But they were also remarkably idiosyncratic. I mean, they're some of the weirdest and funniest people I've ever known. On the other hand, I lived in Cambridge in Central Square for a decade, and surrounded by people who celebrated diversity in every other word, but they were remarkably homogenous. You get past, you scratch the surface, and you discover the exact same outlook in every one of them. They weren't as individualistic as they like to present themselves. In fact, you remember that Far Side cartoon where you've got the penguins, a sea of penguins, and there's this one penguin who's in the middle singing "I Gotta Be Me." That's kind of what it's like in progressivism. They all dress the same, look the same, think the same, and then claim to be the unprecedented and sui generis, whatever. But anyway, so we have the classical liberals. So we have traditionalist conservatism. We have classical liberalism. Is that exhausted, or are there other options?
Yeah, so the kind of the other major option is usually titled neoconservatism. So neo, because they were, generally speaking, kind of latecomers to the conservative movement. So some of the leading lights of this, we were kind of started off as New Deal Democrats, and then they were, as they describe it, mugged by reality. So Irving Kristol and Bill Kristol kind of defended this, and supported the welfare state, but it turns out, there were some downsides to the Great Society. And so they didn't abandon their kind of big government orientation, but they did want to see reform of the welfare state. And they tended to be more hawkish on foreign policy. And this is where when they start entering the Republican Party becomes more hawkish, and kind of culminating in the early 2000s in the Bush administration. The alliance between traditionalist conservatives, neoconservatives, and classical liberals happens because of in the post-war world, you have the Cold War, and all three of those groups do not like communism, and all three of those groups don't like the left, either the old left or the new left in America. So all three of those groups kind of had common enemies, domestically and abroad, and so they made kind of common cause, and it made a great deal of sense for a good half century or so. That they worked together, they founded institutions together. Think of all the major think tanks in D.C. A lot of times those three groups were all involved to a certain greater or lesser extent. And but it starts at the Soviet Union falls, and then you start to kind of see the crack up. You see the differences at a fundamental level. Philosophically, that makes it difficult to keep those three groups together. And I'm painting with a broad brush. There's of course internal sectarian disputes.
Yeah. So, I could, in my mind, we're actually in kind of another term for traditionalist conservatism is paleoconservatism. Sometimes that's the term that's used. We're kind of in the traditionalist conservative moment right now. So what I mean by that is classical liberals kind of had their heyday. Then the neocons had their day. And now we see a whole sort of, I think, coming onto the main, sort of to the forefront of the conservative world, or sort of on stage, people who have more sort of in common with what we've been talking about with regard to traditionalist conservatism. Some of your own writing, I think would be traditionalist in its outlook. Can you give some input on some of the things I've just said, and maybe also talk a little bit about your recent book?
Yeah. So, neoconservatism has fallen out of favor. So it had its heyday during the Bush administration. A lot of the kind of leading lights during that time were described as neoconservative and often described themselves that way. And with the expenses of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the way in which they were not.
Turns out that the traditionalist conservatives were right.
Yes.
The wars were a bad idea.
Yes. So there was there's some eggs on some faces as that has progressed, so they fell out of kind of intellectual favor, and they a number of people, self-described neoconservatives, kind of changed their tune. I mean, they said, I was wrong. I didn't see the right here. And so, interestingly enough, even in our cultural moments of wokeism, kind of a traditionalist conservatism that says, we kind of need our small associations. It turns out the family does matter. It turns out local community, those school boards, those things matter. And so we see this, even among, Democrats who are, hey, wait a second. I want to run my school board, not have this other these crazy people on it.
Yeah.
Are kind of seeing the light of the localism, the traditionalism that the traditionalist conservatives have been kind of championing all along.
Right. Now, when it comes to associations, okay, we're right in your wheelhouse, Luke. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, so I published a book called "Why Associations Matter" in 2020. So it's a new one. It's an academic book, but very reasonably priced on Amazon still. And I in that book I argue that the Supreme Court has gotten freedom of association wrong. So the Supreme Court has noticed that freedom of association is described as a First Amendment right, but if you Google search real quick and look up the First Amendment, it doesn't say freedom of association there. Now, the way the court has been able to describe this right that doesn't appear in the First Amendment, I'll tell you why it's there in a moment. But what the court said is we have the speech clause and the freedom of speech, and in order to have freedom of speech in its full sense, we need to be able to associate with others who are of like mind. So the court calls this expressive association. You have the right of expressive association. That means you can form your group and you can join it and you can exclude people from it who will somehow dampen your ability to express your views. Now, I argue that that's an impoverished understanding of what associations are. So associations are not primarily about expressing your views, although we do that through them, of course. But they're primarily about forming functional relationships. But what I mean by that, I'm drawing this language from Robert Nisbet, is we form our groups for some function. Some are very exalted functions, such as worshiping God. So that's a function of our religious organizations, is to organize the proper worshiping of God and to reconcile man to God. That's its function. And the function of a soccer club is to play soccer. It's to get people together so they can play soccer. And so sometimes our associations are very high and exalted, and sometimes they're very banal. Nonetheless, they all kind of from the top to the bottom are very important. And some of our associations are expressive. We go through them so that we can express our views. Political groups. Think of a group that advocates for expanding the welfare state, or for property rights, or for the pro-life cause. These are expressive associations, and that's perfectly fine. But of course, lots of associations that we have don't fit into those categories. Including, for example, religious organizations. They're not, generally speaking, expressive. That's just not what they're about. They're about meeting to have a Bible study. Think of a campus group. In fact, the Supreme Court has a case on point, Christian Legal Society versus Martinez in 2010. And this is where you really see that the court over the 20th century describing freedom of association as freedom of expressive association really falls apart. So in this case, in 2010, the court said that this religious student group at Hastings Law School, which is a public law school in California, can be forced by its public university to admit all comers into its group. So it can't tell people they can't join if they're not, Christians, which is laughable on its face to most people. But the reason the court got there is it said, well, think about it. All those students who are Christians in Christian Legal Society can still express their views. No one's going to stop. There's no censorship going on. All we're saying is you have to let in people who disagree with you. That's not the purpose of the group. Is not primarily expressing your views on Christianity. It's to fellowship with other Christians who agree with you.
You when we were talking about what we were going to discuss in the course of the show, you mentioned in passing, almost in an offhanded way, that freedom of association is a kind of a traditionalist, conservative sort of thing by definition, and I think we're getting at that right now, in the sense that what this implies is that society is something different from government, and that society exists, prior to government sort of oversight and intervention. A kind of association which comes to mind along these lines is the Union Club in Boston, which was traditionally a men's club, right? Until someone took them to court and sued to join, and it was a woman, of course, and because she saw that this was like a club that was intended to keep moneyed men kind of together and working for their interests, when that was not the expressed intent of the club at all. The expressed intent of the club was to provide a place for men who were gentlemen, which implies a certain social standing, to get together and enjoy each other's company and do things together. Now, there's a sense in which there's obviously going to be some tangential, outcomes from that, institution being, put in place. But the intent was not to promote men. The intent was not to promote business interests. The intent was to provide a place for men to enjoy each other's company as men, and now that's been undermined.
Right. Yeah. So this is the problem with the court's trajectory. Is it undermines the actual associational nature of associations. So it sees associations as purely instrumental, and not instrumental in a kind of a shallow sense, or a shallow sense. So, why do you have the association? For fraternity, I guess that's an instrumental view. It's instrumental in a state-centered way. So the court said, why can you have expressive associations? Because they're good for democracy. So we have a democracy. In order to, have a functioning democracy, you have to have citizens who express their views to each and communicate with each other. One way we do this is through associations. So you think about how I call it I'm not the first to call it this. It's democratic totalitarianism, right? So we can only speak of values and associations insofar as they relate to our democratic government. And if they don't, the court won't provide protection for them. So this has happened with fraternities and sororities. When they come up in the federal courts on freedom of association grounds, the courts will say they're not expressive. So they have no protections. They only have the protections that a university will choose to extend to them. They don't have anything residing in the Constitution. And the way the courts generally treat it is public institutions are bound by the First Amendment in a way that private institutions aren't. So, of course, private colleges and universities have their own freedom of association, but public institutions are bound by the First Amendment. So you got at freedom of association operates as in a conservative way because it preserves these relationships. It doesn't allow the intrusion of political power into these organizations and relationships. So it's I think freedom of association is the court has treated it in such a shallow sense, but it's actually a really profound value. So Robert Nisbet, in his work on communities, he makes exactly this argument about communities is the social realm is separate from the political realm. We tend to conflate them, but they're not the same. And we tend to treat the political state as kind of a further development of the social realm. So, you had the kinship groups and clans in ancient society, and over time they developed a state. They kind of developed into the state. In fact, Aristotle kind of lays this out. You have the families, you have a group of families in the village, and then you have the polis, the state. He's, of course, talking about Greek society, but that basic structure is how we often think about political power. And Nisbet's insight is he says that's not true. Political states usually rise in opposition to kinship. So think of the Roman Empire. So the Roman state in its republican form is basically and a lot of societies actually, in fact, our society actually recognizes this in terms of the language we use. So the Senate is basically the elders, right? It's it comes from it's in Rome it was the leaders of the families, so the great families governed Rome, and then in opposition to them. So, for example, if you were a Roman soldier for a long time and you returned to Rome, you went from being under your general to being under your father. You had to turn over your whatever booty you had from the war, and that was it. And Augustus changes this in the Lex Julii, and the individual soldiers are now loyal to the general. Augustus himself. As you return to Rome, you keep your booty. Needless to say, this is popular with the soldiers. But it devastates the power of the Roman families, and that this kind of this plays out across a lot of societies where the rise of the state is in opposition to the society. So the establishment of the modern states throughout Europe, it's the king, usually a king, centralizing his power against the aristocracy, against the church. And of course, they're very good at playing them off against each other. But the wars of religion, I forget which historian described them as they're wars of political centralization. They're kings seizing property and destroying the other classes. And of course, they're very good at converting to Catholicism. I forget, it was Charles V. I think he was converted 5 times because depending on whose property wanted to stay, and so there was a lot of chicanery that went on. But seeing the political state as Nisbet describes it as inherently revolutionary. And what he means by that is it's always about undermining the social order, taking power away from families, changing property laws so that families and corporations and churches don't have power. They lose their kind of corporate identity over and against the state. So, and many of the of rights that we have kind of are grounded in immunities of associations. So there's a great book by Stephen Smith at the University of San Diego. Came out in 2013. It's The Rise and Decline of American Religious Liberty, I think. And he makes the argument that our First Amendment is actually a resuscitation of the autonomy of the church. So he says that 11th century conflict between the church and the emperor. So the church asserting itself against, at that time, the kings were very fond of appointing bishops and priests in their own kingdoms for obvious reasons. They didn't want these powerful officials to be not under their thumb. And the church pushed back against that and ended up winning the arguments. So the bishops will be, kind of winning the arguments.
You've really given us a lot to talk about and think about here, Luke. And this is really rich stuff. I want to give Tom and Glenn a chance to kind of jump in here and maybe respond and give some other things for you to talk about. So, Glenn, anything you want to say at this point or questions?
Yeah, just as a historical note, Scotland, the history of Scotland in the Middle Ages is the king dies, there's a civil war over who's going to be the next king. One side invites the English in, they put their candidate on the throne, that king rallies the Scots to drive the English out.
Repeat.
Rinse and repeat. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is the way Presbyterianism works in the system, the lairds in Scotland had always been in a tug of war with the king over power. So the lairds always wanted power to devolve away from the central monarchy. The kings always wanted more power. the reason why Scotland adopts the Presbyterian system, which, by the way, was originated in France, the reason why they adopt that system is because the lairds could control the presbyteries and thereby control the church and use that as a counterbalance to the power of the king.
So there's always some kind of hidden agenda here.
Yeah, there's just sort of I'm an institutional historian. That's what I did, specifically ecclesiology. And one of the things I learned is the truth of Bismarck's comment that people who like sausage and respect the law should not watch either of them being made. I mean, this is really a thing. Now, the other comment, though, is something, I believe it was from George Weigel. He said that when Constantine legalized Christianity, there was one principle that was essentially established, and that's that the church is independent of the state, because the church had existed for 300 years as a persecuted minority religion. It didn't depend on the state. It was independent of it. What he said that did is broke the hold of essentially the totalitarian Roman government, because if there is one something that the government doesn't control, it opens up the door for there being other somethings. And this, in turn, becomes the foundation for civil society, through the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So just a couple of ideas that related to what you were talking about.
Yes, yeah. Robert Nisbet would agree.
Yeah, but this is really fascinating. We talk about, we joke about sausage being made. History is basically sausage, you could say, and a lot of the things that we value, cherish, in our political order, our social order, came about through sort of surprising ways, and we just kind of think that these things are immediately obvious to any sort of thinking person, but they're actually matters that have fascinating stories behind them, and learning about those stories actually enriches our understanding of those things. But I think also helps us appreciate God's providence, as God is at work through all of these very compromised people and kind of shady movements, that kind of stuff. So, Tom, do you have anything you wanted to ask or mention here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll see if I can make a coherent thread here, because there are a few things you talked about at different places that I'll see if this will make sense. So, a while back in the conversation, you were talking about the difference between sort of traditional conservatism and then sort of progressive, leftism. In one sense, the difference between the notion of liberating the citizen in the way in which institutions almost are to function as in the service of that kind of liberation. And then tied to that, see if I can hold this thread together, where the differing notions and the differing kinds of conservatism, the different anthropologies, you have in traditional conservatism, one in which, if we could use the language, the person is formed by these institutions, not just in a functional way, but I think, as you said, because they're really connected to them naturally and spiritually and everything else. It's where the humane becomes significant, the passing on. Whereas in certain libertarian conceptions that are in some of these other forms, the will is almost considered, very voluntarist, and almost as if it generates a whole expressive world of itself. So you almost have anthropologies more amenable to progressive and leftist in some of these other kinds of so-called conservatism than they do with classical conservatism, which is about the human being immersed in creation and its moral and social orders. So I don't know, maybe you could flesh out some more of that, or...
Yeah. No, what you said is correct. Yes, the treatment of the individual as kind of abstract being that magically comes into existence, fully formed with thoughts and sentiments as if they just didn't come from anywhere. And we know Nisbet has a line in one of his books, The Social Bond, and he says something like we sometimes talk about individuals as if they're these atoms. Literally, we're in physics and we can talk about atoms, but we never find an individual on the one hand, you only see individuals, right? You walk into a church, you don't see a church, you see a bunch of individuals.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you never see an individual without their association. You don't see them without, there's no individual in existence that didn't have parents.
Yeah.
And there's, it's
they're trying. They're trying.
Huxley.
And there's something like I like to point out with what we know about children's brain development, right? Is we know kind of very sadly from children who are dumped in some of the orphanages,
right?
Yes, and in Eastern Europe, I've read some stories about these, and they won't take care of them, right? So I mean, they're not hugged, their diapers are changed, and they are moved along an assembly line, literally, when they're taken care of, and so their brain doesn't develop. It can't develop.
Right.
So our brains are literally developed by our interactions with other human beings. So, everyone who's listening to this and can process it owes some people a huge debt of gratitude because somebody held you for a while when you were crying and you don't remember it. And that's the only reason that you're capable of what you're capable of. And so these are personal interactions. So the way we're describing individuals in some of these movements is just simply false. It's not, and we knew it at the time, and as cognitive science has only told us what we are. I think which is the social thinker. He has a great quip that social scientists are only useful when they tell us what we already knew. It's in which case who needs them? But and that's exactly right. They're telling us. It turns out parents are really important. It turns out, who knew having a father in the home is really important. We knew conservatives were onto that a long time ago. We didn't need to watch massive social experiments go badly, and then to learn these things.
Which I think it brings up the question: why this sort of like higher illiteracy? Why the stupidity? What's going on with that? Because related to what you were just talking about, we know. Mysteriously in a certain sense, but kind of obviously in another sense, that a baby, a newborn, is in an ongoing way biologically committed to his or her mother in ways that we are just now beginning to sort of and document scientifically, but I think instinctively, or maybe that's not the right way to put it. We just knew before. A baby should be with her mother or his mother, and if he or she is, good things happen. And what it turns out, it's actually the case. It's we understand that within the womb, that there's a kind of development process that's occurring that the mother's obviously directly connected with. But what turns out, it continues after birth, and it has to be the biological mother. In other words, it's not enough for just any caring person to come along and pick up the baby and care for the baby. It really does need to be the mother. And if that does not occur, there really are some negative consequences.
Attachment issue.
Doesn't matter how politically incorrect. Yeah, it doesn't matter how politically incorrect it is. There's something biochemically that's going on. It's not even an attachment issue. It's not even in the sense that the child knows this is my mother. There's actually something physiologically that's going on that only the mother is able to help occur. And this came out in the New York Times, and of course, all of the people on the left just flipped their lids. But it's just a fact.
Yeah. Well, it's some of the research on cells from babies kind of get incorporated into the mother's body, which might explain why mothers know when something happens to their child. They'll know, but there might actually be like a literal biological connection across space that is still there even decades later, and we're just barely tapping into it. But here's what the conservative would say, the traditionalists would say: we knew this from human experience. We knew this from literally hundreds of millions of mothers. We already knew that experience. Who testified to this. We didn't have to kind of wipe the slate clean and start over.
But that's what they always want to do. That's what they want to do. That's their understanding of freedom. Their understanding of freedom is total autonomy. Nothing is a given. Everything is, up to us and our choices. That's the ground of reality is, autonomous choice. It's stupid, but they're willing to be stupid intentionally.
Yeah. It's kind of, it goes back to Rousseau as many things do. you got to wipe the slate clean because all of our social attachments are. I see Glenn smiling. It's all our social attachments are inherently debilitating.
Yeah.
So what do we have to do with education? Primarily, it's freeing children from the prejudices of their fathers. That's the primary thing. And everyone would be great if we could just get rid of our associational attachments. We could see crime disappear. We could see all this. There's no way. What happens when somebody's unattached? They're the worst people of all.
That's right.
Or they're self-destructive. This is where many traditionalist conservatives are religious for very obvious reasons, but Nisbet wasn't. He was an agnostic, and he was heavily reliant upon Emil Durkheim, who was an atheist.
Right.
But what they saw in Durkheim was an atheist. He was a radical in many of his politics. But when he looked around him, he said, every group that's less socially attached has every social pathology you can imagine, like higher suicide rates, higher crime rates. Like, we need associations. Now, he had just kind of obviously he wasn't religious. He had an account that a religious person can't accept, kind of in the final analysis. Sure. But they're insights over how society works.
Well, this brings up a great sort of segue for something we talked about in the pre-show conversation, and that is, working with people in the academy, in the world of ideas that we may not be on the same page with on every matter. So sometimes people will wonder, about the three of us and the friendships that we have with Roman Catholics, and they'll say, don't you realize that they're wrong on soteriology? But that's what that implies in their mind is that we're not supposed to have friendships with them or ever agree with them about anything else ever. But in reality, for those of us who are, people who've had some background in the academy, just singling out Roman Catholics or of a particular kind, traditionalist Roman Catholics, anyone who understands, Roman Catholicism knows that it's a very sort of a diverse community. But the traditionalist Roman Catholics are often our staunchest allies as Reformed, sort of intellectuals when it comes to the life of the mind because of a range of things. One of them, obviously, being we both believe in God. But here you bring up the prospect that there are people who are agnostic, as with regard to Nisbet, or even atheists like Durkheim, who we can agree with on certain matters. Can you reflect a little bit on what it means to be, say, a Reformed traditionalist conservative in the academy, doing your work, and how it sort of, working with other people that you don't necessarily agree with in every respect comes into play?
So kind of a concern with me, given my particular religious and philosophical commitments, is, about the role aesthetically of, beauty, the role of goodness and truth, all these sorts of things. But Roman Catholics, I really see sometimes the wisdom of C.S. Lewis when he talks, I think it's in Mere Christianity, where he says, of the three great branches of Christianity, the ones who are the most kind of devout within their tribe end up being the ones closest to each other. They're kind of closest to the center, you might say. And a big mistake I've seen with Protestants is they'll think liberal Catholics are kind of reformist Catholics. They're about to be Protestant. That's how they see it. We agree. And what they don't realize is, liberal Catholics are even more insufferable than liberal Presbyterians.
It's so true.
And what we find is, it is true. There's some soteriological disagreements between Reformed, conservative Reformed, and conservative Catholics. But conservative Catholics will, a big one is, the meaning of the Eucharist, for example. See a disagreement. But what you'll see is if you tell a traditionalist Catholic that you're going to take the Eucharist, in their face there turns it like the horror. But the reason is they actually believe in the body and blood of Christ. Like, they think that a historical event 2,000 years ago actually happened, and they believe in the miracle of the Mass, and now Reformed have disagreements over this. But we both agree on the original event in a way that, like, a liberal Catholic is like, it doesn't matter. That's because they don't agree with the original event. And we disagree over its meaning, but we agree with the original event. And so there's a lot of alliances that can happen. I mean, Robert George, the great political theorist at Princeton, is very open and warm towards evangelicals. And the reason is he understands exactly this. Like, we're on the same page 90% of the time. And the cultural ramifications of what we believe religiously, even if we have some religious disagreements, are virtually identical. We want to see strong families. We want to see strong churches. And what Glenn mentioned earlier about the institutional separation that Christianity brought, where this institution, these churches, just were not part of the Roman state for centuries. It meant that civil society was a thing that came into existence, and the pattern of freedom of association is patterned after religious liberty, which is the freedom of the church to minister to people without the intrusions of the king. Or parliament or a Congress. And that's something we would agree on. We might disagree on which church and have some definitional things, but we're actually going to say almost the same thing on religious liberty. We're going to say almost the exact same thing on abortion, just in the headlines right now. And so in all sorts of ways, we're on the same page. And it's kind of one of those things where I do not want to say these theological points are unimportant. They are very important. But there is something to be said for, kind of remembering the creeds, where, they're not they didn't get into the weeds on the treatises. And there was something to be important in, I don't want to say it's unimportant to work out the theological ramifications, but that it's focusing, and Reform should understand this, focusing on the person of Christ is actually this really a really uniting thing in the very best sense. It really brings us all together in the very best sense, the right people together. Robert George certainly understands that, and he's been unbelievably helpful to a ton of Protestants through his work at the James Madison program at Princeton. So really giving career boosts to a lot of evangelical scholars. Mark Hall is going to be there next year, the great kind of religious liberty scholar at George Fox, who's an evangelical. So it's really, should really see them as allies in all sorts of ways. Gresham Machen has a passage in Christianity and Liberalism where he says, we're on the same page with Catholics and all sorts of things. It's just we can't be in communion with them. But we agree with a lot. We're the same religion. We just aren't the same church. And so we can work together. And that's even more true when we think of ourselves as the same movement, the same intellectual circles. So APL, tons of Catholics and a good sampling of Reformed Protestants as well.
The Acton Institute I'm not sure it still has had the similar makeup, but it used to be a combination of Reformed and Catholic guys. They all knew the differences, and they all got along because they all recognized the differences were important. That was the thing that was the most interesting comment that they made to me.
Yeah, well, and the same thing's true at Touchstone and the folks out at the Fellowship of St. James. But I just saw the other day that the Acton Institute is behind the translation and publication of Abraham Kuyper's extended, sort of as his whole corpus into English. And so, if you want to get some, Kuyper, who's like uber Calvinist, I guess you could say, you got to go to the Acton Institute, which it has some Catholics involved. But that's kind of a fascinating thing to think about. Anyway, all of this stuff is kind of great to consider, particularly related to the Academy of Philosophy and Letters, which is having its annual conference. We're going to put this. We're going to publish this particular show next week so that people can be aware of the conference. Now, the conference is an invitation-only kind of thing, but it's a sort of thing that we'd like to let folks know about, particularly folks who listen to the podcast who might have an interest in actually joining, being part of the development of the Academy. Is there anything you might want to say about the Academy of Philosophy and Letters as we wrap up here, Luke, to kind of encourage people to do that?
Yeah, so we're hosting our conference June 2nd through 4th in College Park, Maryland, at the College Park Marriott. So you can go to philosophyandletters.org. You can register. So we do require a sponsor, but feel free to put my name down, or if I may, you can put Chris's name down as well. And we'd like to see you there. You will find other traditionalist conservatives, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, and agnostic, all traditionalist conservatives, but of various theological commitments, come to the conference. We're discussing the idea of, you might say, after disorder. So we've seen a lot of disorder socially and culturally in the last two years, and we're going to be discussing some solutions, ways of understanding it and the ways of getting past it.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And by the way, what you'll find, at the Academy, but also in other places that are made up of traditionalist conservatives from different backgrounds, is that there's no self-editing going on. So the Roman Catholics will get up and you'll know that they're Catholics. And the Reformed guys will get up and you know that they're Reformed, that kind of thing. So it's kind of an ecumenism in the best sense, where everybody actually is what they say and not trying to find the lowest common denominator. But anyway, hey, Luke, it's been great to have you on the show. It's been,
thank you.
I think we ought to have you back sometime to talk a little more about some of these themes, particularly the ones that we didn't get into in the kind of depth that would have been good to get into. But anyway, is there anything that you want to say about how people can find you and maybe find your work and that kind of thing as we wrap up?
Oh, yeah. So if you Google my name, the work will come up. My book's sold on Amazon. It's very, very reasonably priced. And you can also go to lukesheahan.com. You'll find just some links there. Find my name on the Duquesne faculty webpage and see some stuff there. You're welcome to reach out to me and discuss Robert Nisbet or Russell Kirk or pitch an essay or book review to the Bookman.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, the way Luke spells his last name is S-H-E-A.
That's right.
H-A-N. That's usually the thing I'm sure people leave out. So if you're going to find you online, you got to include that extra A.
That's right. The S-H-E-A-H-A-N. It's something like 20% of Sheahans spell it this way.
Well, then it kind of narrows it down and they'll find you.
That's right.
Hey, well, thanks a lot again, Luke. And as we wrap up, we want to thank you for listening to the Theology Podcast. We appreciate your support. Lots of folks give money to us on an ongoing basis. Lots of folks recommend us to other people. The show continues to grow, and we're astonished by the fact that we talk about these esoteric matters and people are interested and tune in. But anyway, enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye now.